Our world is at a turning point. Globalization is under siege. Tensions between the US and China are growing. Like everyone else, we in Singapore are anxious. We wonder what the future holds and how countries can collectively find a way forward to maintain peace and prosperity in the world. What can the history of Southeast Asia tell us about avoiding upheavals and disasters in our path ahead? This year, as you've heard from John, Singapore is commemorating our bicentennial. 200 years ago, Stamford Raffles, an Englishman, landed in Singapore and founded a trading post here. The Dutch had already colonized the Dutch East Indies, so the British were actually latecomers to Southeast Asia. Raffles was Lieutenant Governor of Bencoolen on the west coast of Sumatra. He saw the trade potential of the region and decided to look for a new outpost for the British East India Company along the Straits of Malacca. He chose Singapore, and that changed our destiny. The Dutch protested Raffles' action furiously, but in vain. To preserve their monopoly, the Dutch had either prohibited foreign ships from operating in their ports or imposed high tariffs. Raffles took a different approach. He set up Singapore as a free port. Trade boomed and the settlement prospered. The more open approach of the British delivered superior results. Over the next century, Southeast Asia was divided between British, Dutch, Spanish, French, and later the Americans. Their rivalry was intense. No single colonial power dominated the region. In the 20th century, the interests of the great powers continued to intersect in Southeast Asia. In 1941, Imperial Japan invaded Indochina. The US retaliated with an oil embargo on Japan. And this was the immediate trigger for the Pacific War. On the same day that Japan bombed Pearl Harbor, they also attacked Malaya and Singapore. There followed for us, in Singapore, the Japanese occupation. 3 years and 8 months of oppression, fear, and misery. During the Cold War, Southeast Asia was again on the front line. The region was split between communist and non-communist states. Vietnam became the battlefield for a proxy war between the two camps. Meanwhile, China supported communist insurgencies and promoted armed revolution in the non-communist countries, including Malaysia and Singapore. This was the backdrop when the 5 non-communist countries in Southeast Asia, Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore, Philippines, Thailand, came together to form ASEAN in 1967. It was a remarkable act of statesmanship. Several of the partners had a recent history of conflict with one another, and the wounds had yet to heal fully. But with ASEAN, the 5 countries eschewed conflict and took the path of dialogue, cooperation, and friendship. We integrated into the world economy, linked up with the advanced countries, and thrived. Meanwhile, the communist countries in Indochina were held back for decades by successive wars and the rigidity of their command economies. After the Cold War ended, the US became the sole superpower. Southeast Asia entered a new phase. The Indo-Chinese Wars finally ended, and the Indo-Chinese communist countries opened up. Earlier, Vietnam had invaded Cambodia, thus posing a serious threat to its non-communist neighbors. But now Vietnam joined ASEAN, together with Cambodia, Laos, and Myanmar. It was a case of beating swords into plowshares. Over the next decades, Southeast Asia benefited from a favorable external environment. The US was a dominant power in the Asia-Pacific and a stabilizing security presence. International trade was expanding rapidly. Trade barriers came down, often led by the United States. The ASEAN economies prospered through export-led growth and foreign investments. International frameworks like the WTO and the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, UNCLOS, established rules, managed conflict, balanced competing interests, and fostered cooperation between countries big and small. Initially, China only played a minor economic role, but as its economy took off, it became a growing partner of the ASEAN countries and a major participant in regional affairs. I recount this history to show that Southeast Asia is no stranger to the great game of nations, and to offer some historical perspective on the current strategic situation. The US-China bilateral relationship is the most important in the world today. How the two work out their tensions and frictions will define the international environment for decades to come.